Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop and to track 3 focused on networking, collaboration, and scientific innovation in conferences and meetings. My name is Dana Green-Schlosser, and I am a health scientist administrator in the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at the NIH. I'm also a member of the Future of Scientific Conferencing Workshop Planning Committee. I'll be moderating this session focused on forging social connections, formal and informal networking at scientific conferences. In this session, we'll hear a brief presentation from each speaker, each followed by brief time for a clarifying Q&A. After all of the presentations, we will engage in a group moderated discussion, including questions that are submitted by the audience. At any time in this session, you may use your Q&A function to submit your questions for the speakers. You may also use the chat function to share your thoughts and engage in discussion virtually. So, what I would like to do is now introduce, and I'm pleased to introduce, the speakers in this session. And for additional information about each speaker, you can access the speaker biography platform. The first speaker is Ariana Wenger. She is a doctoral student in the Transdisciplinary Lab, the TD Lab, at the Department of Environmental System Science at ETH in Zurich. The second speaker will be Dr. Emma Sajaldia from Intelligence Community Postdoctoral Research Fellow at High Meadows Environmental Institute Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And then our third speaker will be a speaker duo of Dr. Josh Gutwill and Dr. Sue Allen, who are co-directors of the Clean Conferencing Institute. Now, let's begin with our first presenter for first presentation by Ariana Wenger.
Yes, so thank you very much for the introduction, and hello to everybody who is here. Maybe first a short description of myself for those with low vision. I'm a young white woman, and I also wear glasses. And as it was already said, I'm a doctoral student at the TD Lab at ETH Zurich, and I'm currently in my final year of my dissertation that I'm writing on the topic of academic air travel reduction and virtual communication with a specific focus on conferences. And today I will present a few findings and insights from the past years of my dissertation. And I'm also already looking forward to the discussion afterwards with you and the other presenters. So first, I would like to give a bit of background, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. Researchers have been going to conferences for decades, and usually these conferences were held at one conference venue, and people would travel there and meet in person. And also the typical traditional conference program looked something like this here on the slide. So usually there's an opening, then there are keynote talks and parallel sessions and also poster presentations. And in between there's usually breaks, so coffee breaks, lunch breaks, and often there's also evening receptions or dinners. And together with colleagues of mine, I structured the reasons why researchers attend conferences that were mentioned in the scientific literature. And we found the following conference purposes. So researchers attend conferences to form and maintain their networks, to exchange knowledge, to initiate new collaborations, to gain skills, for example, presentation skills, and to gain also job opportunities. And with that, they aim to earn reputation, to form their professional identities, to gain visibility, receive funding, and overall to advance their career. And I think this makes it quite apparent why conferences are so important. And they are actually also one of the most important travel reasons for for researchers. This was shown by studies from other universities and also from a preliminary analysis of the data from my own university. And I think everybody knows that during the pandemic, we had this quite abrupt shift towards the virtual format and the establishment of a lot of virtual conferences. And here just a little bit of an overview or a selection of different virtual tools and formats and platforms that were used, because these virtual conferences really didn't equal each other. They were quite diverse and they varied in like the structure and the tools and formats that were used. So some of them were like more as like a live streaming platform, so the webinar style, which is similar to like watching YouTube videos. And other virtual conferences used platforms and tools that allowed for more interaction between the attendees. So chat platforms like Slack, or brainstorming platforms like Mural, or also video communication as, for example, Zoom, as we probably all know. And then some of these virtual conferences also experimented with VR software, or like these more avatar-based software as GatherTown. During that time, I conducted 2 surveys at my own university, so ETH, and I examined the perspectives around air travel reduction and virtual communication of the scientific staff and the professors. And what you can actually see on this graph, on this slide, is that the researchers perceived virtual conferences less positive than virtual meetings. And also when they were like looking back, they perceived that, or they believed that their opinion on virtual conferences actually increased and got more positive since before the pandemic. In these surveys, I also asked participants about the potential benefits of virtual conferences. And one of the main benefits that was mentioned, or that they perceived as the biggest benefit, was the lower carbon footprint. I mean, we heard a lot about this aspect that virtual conferences have way lower carbon footprints in also the last week's session. And then another benefit was the lower costs, because you don't have to pay for the attendance or registration fees at some point, or they are maybe lower, and you don't have to pay for the travel costs or accommodation costs. And also the better accessibility and inclusivity, which was also talked about in last week's session. And last but not least, that there is less stress with traveling, because you do not need to travel, right? So nevertheless, researchers also perceive that these virtual conferences came with some challenges, or that they pose some challenges. For example, the difficulties with technical equipment, or connectivity issues, or the time zone differences, and screen fatigue if you're like staring at the screen for an entire day. And what I want to show in this slide is that I let the participant rate the effectiveness of different aspects during the virtual conferences. And they said that virtual conferences are quite effective for like the formal part, so like giving a talk. But what stood out is that they perceived the virtual conferences as least effective for all of the informal parts. So networking, personal interactions, social interactions, and actually other studies or literature on this confirmed that the biggest perceived disadvantage of virtual conferences is the lack of networking. This is why I then decided to conduct a study specifically on networking during virtual conferences, and I conducted 21 interviews with virtual conference organizers and attendees from different backgrounds, so different scientific fields, career positions, and countries. And what these interviews showed was that the experience with the virtual conferences were quite diverse. So they had very different experience. But overall, many of my participants mentioned factors that they felt would influence the networking experience during virtual conferences. And I actually used the input process output framework to structure these factors that they mentioned would facilitate or hinder networking during virtual conferences. And for example, one of the categories of factors was the conference attendees' personal characteristics, such as their motivation to use virtual platforms or their technology readiness. Another important factor was the group composition. So many preferred in small groups in the virtual format. And also an important point was the conference organizers' leadership. So like their motivation to really make efforts and show commitment to carefully think about the structure of the virtual conference, and to also specifically plan for networking sessions, like planning networking sessions into the program. Another point are, of course, the technical resources, so like which platforms and tools are used, but then even more important is the technical support and the training, especially for the speakers, like before the conference. Other points that were mentioned were to provide a lot of opportunities to discuss and interact between the participants, and to also plan for breaks between the sessions, and to specifically plan social activities, for example, online games, into the program. So since the last year and this year, as the pandemic travel restrictions have been lifted, what we are observing is actually a bounce back to conference air travel and the establishment of hybrid conferences that allow for in-person and virtual participation. And these hybrid formats vary a lot in their designs. And here on the slide, you can see two of the most important formats. So one is like the central location, or what I call the central location. So a conference held at one conference venue, and then a live stream, or the opportunity for to also have virtual presentation. And the other is like the multi-hub format, where you have a conference spread across the world with different in-person hubs where people can travel to the one that is closest to them, but then also allow for additional virtual participation and virtual guests. But as these hybrid formats have only recently been established, I think that still many questions remain. So for example, the question of is it the best of both worlds, or is it actually or does it lead to a two-class system between the in-person and the virtual attendees? And I think we should also think and do research on the potential increase in financial and organizational costs for the conference organizers. So to conclude, I would like to say that virtual conferences provide a more sustainable and inclusive alternative to in-person conferences. One of my studies showed that best practice examples actually exist of how to do effective networking during virtual conferences. And I believe that the long-standing norms for attending in-person conferences need to be changed, and that new virtual norms need to be established over the years. And there also seems to be this bounce back towards in-person conferences and the establishment of new hybrid conference formats that need to be examined. And I really believe that conference organizers should more specifically think about which goals they aim to achieve with their conference, and then in a second step, think about the format and the structure that is best fits to achieve these goals, and then also is most sustainable. And this is also actually where my current study leads. So I'm conducting a survey at the moment to better understand why researchers attend conferences and what they expect to gain at conferences. And the survey is targeted at researchers from all scientific disciplines, different geographic regions and career stages. And I aim to analyze the differences in these expectations between researchers, for example, from different regions of the world. So if you would like to contribute to my study and share your perspective, please visit the link or scan the QR code that is linked on this slide. and I would appreciate your support. And with that, I would also like to end my presentation and thank you for your attention. And I think we have some time for a few clarifying questions, if there are any.
Yes, we do have time for a couple of clarifying questions for Dr. Winner. And we can take those either from the Q&A. So if you have a question, please submit them in the Q&A and I can pull those. Or if any of the other fellow panelists have questions, feel free to unmute your camera and audio and ask those. Has there been a lot of consideration instead of trying to go exclusively or go to a hybrid format, alternate on some sort of schedule between an in-person and an all virtual meeting? And then I did see another question come in, so.
Yes, so this is certainly something that I have been observing, that actually some of the scientific associations are doing now, that they say, okay, no, hybrid can really lead to this two-class system. We prefer to either have it in person or have it fully virtual, because then everybody or all of the attendees are kind of on the same level. And then they would alternate. They would say, okay, we do every second year only in person, and every other year we do the virtual format, which I think is also a good or can have its advantages, because yes, hybrid conferences could lead to this two-class system.
Right. Thank you. The question that I just saw in the Q&A was asking if your survey was given to academics that haven't attended online conferences, or have they all attended virtual events?
So the survey that I'm conducting now is for all types of conferences. And the previous surveys and also the interviews I did with the conference organizers and attendees, these were all virtual. This was during the pandemic, where most were fully virtual.
Great. And then one last quick question is, have you thought about equity considerations in terms of internet access for participants from developing countries?
Yes, I think this is a very, very important question, and I think that's also where I try to go with my current research, because I want to analyze these differences between exactly different geographic regions and see the expectations. And I think this is a very good point. So in some countries they don't have good internet access. So for them it would even be more important to be able to go to a conference in person and not like having to attend online. But of course, yeah, this needs to be also thought about more and yeah, incorporated. Or also sometimes, I mean, it doesn't always need to be synchronous online conferences, right? So I know also of asynchronous online conferences. So I think it's more easy if you don't have stable internet access. So like, then you don't have to be online at a certain time. And if you maybe don't have access during that time, then you can just fill it out whenever you have access. Or also without the video and so on, it needs less stable internet connection. So that is certainly also an opportunity. And I've heard of those conferences, and I've heard about good feedback.
Oh, that's a great idea. I think it's going to take these out of the box ideas to really tackle these type of problems. And I see that Dr. Allen also put in that these particular participants in developing countries often don't have money to travel either. So I would think that would be something that societies should probably could potentially address through.
Yeah, or the other option are these, of course, these hub conferences, right? Or some Correct. Of the conferences also didn't offer like a real hub, but more of like watch parties, local watch parties, where maybe a a local university or so that has stable internet access can provide like a viewing for everybody in the region or nearest surroundings that can go there, and then they don't have to travel further, which they might not have the money for.
Terrific. I think we will move on to the next speaker, and we'll take any other questions for at the end. And I would like to go ahead and present or introduce our next presenter, who is Dr. Emma Zdjela, and I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today and talk a little bit about catalyzing collaborations and fostering community, a quantitative comparison of virtual and in-person conference modalities. Before I start, just a description of myself for those with visual impairments. I'm a white woman wearing glasses with long red hair and a bookcase behind me. So we know that we need scientific collaboration in order to achieve a sustainable future. We know that we need scientific collaboration to achieve a sustainable future. And I find it interesting that many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of them, require science to be achieved. So for example, goal number 6, clean water and sanitation, 7, affordable and clean energy, and 13, climate action. But there's actually a specific goal, which is goal 17, called building bridges, partnerships for the goals. And what I see here is the need for these partnerships in science to address issues including health, environmental protection, and peace. Now, we also know that research is increasingly performed in teams. And in this plot on the left, you can see the changes over time in the fraction of papers and patents written in teams, which is this panel A. Which is in this panel A. So you can see that the percentage of papers and patents written in teams has been steadily increasing over time. And then in B, you can see that the mean team size has also increased over time. So we know that there's this need for scientific collaboration. And scientific conferences, like Ariane just mentioned, many of their goals can serve as these idea colliders. And in fact, collaborators who did not meet in the same city, about 1/6 said that they met at a conference. Now, these conferences also come with a lot of costs. In the US alone, they amount to billions of dollars per year, and that's not to account for the environmental cost, opportunity cost, and also social costs that come with attending these conferences. With the pandemic, there was really this need to reevaluate how we should conduct meetings. And to do so, I feel that we needed data and analysis to be able to address this question. So the question that we set out to address is, how effective are conferences, particularly at forming collaborations, and can we use this information to optimize them? To answer this, we developed a mathematical model which predicts how likely 2 people who co-attend a conference are to form a new collaboration. And more specifically, this determines the probability that any pair of participants at a conference will collaborate, given how their interaction was throughout the conference. To develop this model, we were inspired by the physicist Serge Galam, who said, "Do humans behave like atoms?" And we consider scientists at a conference like molecules in a solution, as you can see in the figure on the right. So consider a pair of participants at a conference. We make several assumptions. One, that the probability of collaborating, P of T, is going to rise as participants spend increasing time interacting together. That the more intense the interaction, or in our analogy, the more concentrated the solution, makes the probability rise faster. And finally, that when the interaction among participants stops, the probability is going to start to decline. So one of the simplest models that we could write down for this is a linear process, where the change in probability over time, dp dt, is equal to a strengthening term with S times I for interaction, normalized by a maximum possible interaction, times 1 minus P, minus a weakening term, which represents how the interaction ceases, and leading to the probability decay. Now, there were some limitations of this model, which is the fact that once the participants have ceased to interact, their probability would relax to some minimal probability level after the interaction has ceased. And what this implies is that people would forget each other, but that's not realistic, because we assume that if people have interacted sufficiently strongly, they'll actually remember one another, maybe send each other an email a year later, and actually start a collaboration. So this is why we developed the nonlinear memory model, which takes into account the fact that this probability of collaborating will remain at a non-zero higher level even after the interaction has ceased. Here you can see an interactive version of these models. You can either scan the QR code or go to this link if you want to play with it yourself. On the top figure, you can see the interaction between two participants at the conference. You can imagine that the participants were in a medium-sized group with a medium level of interaction. A little bit later, they're at a smaller group for a shorter period of time, have a more intense interaction, and towards the end of the conference have again a medium-sized interaction. On the lower panel, you can see in orange the linear model, where you would see an increase as interaction rises, a decrease as interaction ceases, and at the end it goes back down to this zero level. Whereas in the case of the blue model, the blue curve, which represents the nonlinear memory model, once this threshold has been exceeded, the participants will remain in this higher memory probability of collaborating. Now, perhaps some of the most exciting part of this research for us was actually partnering with the Research Corporation for Science Advancement and their SciLog conferences. So the Research Corporation for Science Advancement is actually the oldest science philanthropy in the US. And they organized a series of conferences known as the SciLog, which stands for Science Dialogue, in a couple series over several years. So there were 12 in-person conferences that we considered and 6 virtual during the pandemic over the period of almost 10 years. This represents over 20,000 pairs of potential collaborators. Now, each conference has an interactive format with around 50 invited participants for 3 days, which is specifically aimed at generating new collaborations. We have network data on exactly how well everyone knew everyone else before the conference from a pre-conference survey. Participants are also algorithmically assigned to different sessions, so we know exactly the interaction patterns of people throughout the conference. And finally, at the end of the conference, participants self-assemble into teams and submit proposals, around 20 to 30 of them. And typically 5 to 8 of these proposals are ultimately funded. Some empirical results. We found that collaborators spent about twice as much effective time together than non-collaborators. What this means by effective time is time that's weighted more strongly if you're in a smaller group. And this was equivalent to being in a group of 12 people for an hour or being in a group of 4 people for 22 minutes. You can see on the figure on the left, this represents in orange the pairs who ultimately did not collaborate, and in blue those who did. And you can see that for each of these conferences, the level of interaction for the pairs who collaborated was greater than the non-collaborators. We also found a causal effect based on additional analysis of interaction on collaboration. So being in a session together actually causes you to collaborate. We tested the role of smaller groups compared to larger groups and found that small groups of about 3 to 4 people were disproportionately impactful for collaboration. So co-attending a small group increased your chance of collaboration by about 7 times. And finally, we found that the nonlinear memory model that we developed performed very well at actually predicting this data, despite its conceptual simplicity, in 7 out of the 8 conferences that we tested. Now, we also wanted to compare virtual conferences to in-person conferences. And what we found is we computed what we called the interaction ratio. So this is the ratio between the blue bars and the orange bars, which represents how predictable teams are. And what we found is on the right, the formal interaction ratio at virtual conferences was 30% higher compared to in-person conferences, which means that teams formed at virtual conferences were more predictable based on groups that participants were assigned to compared to in-person conferences. However, this is also indicating to us that many of the informal connections that might be created at in-person conferences were absent, despite the fact that the conferences were almost one-to-one structured the same and included informal interaction in platforms like GatherTown. To investigate this further, we wanted to look at how the network of awareness changed before and after virtual and in-person conferences. So not just looking at collaboration, but actually looking at how well connected the networks were. And just to mention, these are interdisciplinary scientific topics. So on the left, you can see the results for in-person conferences. The complete left before shows the fraction of pairs that had no prior knowledge of one another before the conference and after the conference. And you can see that that is about halved in the case of an in-person conference, whereas it's about 2/3 in the case of the virtual conference. What you can see in these network figures below, these are again the networks of awareness, how well participants knew each other before and after the conference. So on the left in blue are the connections before the conference, and the orange is the new connections formed. And you can see that there are fewer connections being formed in the virtual case. And in fact, in terms of this connecting efficiency metric, in-person conferences were about twice as effective at connecting communities. We also wanted to look at a measure of engagement to see how participants joined teams. So in a virtual environment, you lose about 10% of people who did not join teams at in-person, at virtual compared to in-person. However, for those who did engage and joined at least one team, there was no difference in the number of teams that they joined. I'd like to end on some of our current and future research. So one of the coolest things about this research, as I mentioned, was the SciLog dataset, which we are eventually planning to release for public use. We have data on multiple scales of these conferences. A lot of what I focused on today was a scale of days with how teams were being formed at a conference, looking at modeling team formation in virtual and in-person modalities. We also have some ongoing research on homophily effects in teams. We have longer term effects of this over years. And finally, we can also look at more granular data of scientific conversation on the scale of minutes. So stay tuned for our SciLog data. And with this, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators and please feel free to check out a paper in physical review research if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of minutes for any questions or thoughts. If you'll remember to type your question into the Q&A and I can ask that for you, or if any of the panelists want to unmute their camera or audio, that would be terrific as well. Are there any other thoughts or questions? If not, we can move to the next speaker, and I'm sure there'll be other ones that come in as we move along. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and cue the next speaker up, and that will be our final presentation, which will be by Drs. Josh Gutwill and Dr. Sue Allen.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. For those with low vision, I'm a white woman with glasses and short brown hair, and I'm wearing a dark blouse. And Jay, did you want to say hi?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Josh Gutwill, and I am a white man with brown hair and a beard, and I'm wearing a blue button-down shirt.
Great. So just by way of intro, that we've been hearing some wonderful research presentations today, and also last week. And for this talk, we are going to be taking a more practical stance, kind of a bit similar to the plenary we heard this morning. So we're asking the question, how can you improve informal networking in virtual conferences? And as you've heard now many times from the previous speakers as well, we know that this is one of the hardest things to replicate in a virtual space, and it's very important to attendees. So we are Sue Allen and Josh Gutwill. We're both learning science researchers, and we are co-directors of the Clean Conferencing Institute. The Clean Conferencing Institute is a nonprofit, and we have one single goal, and that is to make virtual conferencing good enough that associations of all kinds will do more of it. And that's for all the reasons you've been hearing throughout this conference, but particularly promoting inclusion and environmental sustainability. And we do it through a combination of mostly learning, testing, and sharing ideas. And then there are 3 little points here about how we work. One is that we advocate for associations of all kinds to alternate between the virtual and in-person so that they can get the benefits of both without having to take on the extra challenges of hybrid. And we talked a little about some of those, and we can talk more about them later. But we really try to promote the alternating model. Then in terms of technologies, one of the sessions following this one will focus on immersive technologies like virtual reality, but we made the decision to focus on mostly current or near current technologies. And that's because we're just very aware of the urgency of the climate crisis. And so we're trying to focus on what can be done now or very soon so that any improvements we design or we learn about can be adopted quickly at large scale. And lastly, we really try to be a conduit for good ideas happening anywhere. So please use the chat to post your suggestions or links to resources or any alternative ideas to contribute to the discussion as we go along. This is our theoretical framework, and it focuses on 3 ways to improve virtual networking, which are platforms, activities, and social norms. And this framework is quite similar to some others in the literature. If you're familiar with Brown and Drakely 2023 and Lalu et al. 2021, there are other frameworks out there that are quite similar, focused on supporting social interaction at virtual events in general, not just conferences. We're working currently in all 3 areas with a focus, again, on how to improve informal networking at virtual conferences. So in this talk, we'd like to just share a few examples of some of the ideas we're exploring. Some of them are things you've probably already know about and used, but hopefully others are going to be a bit new. And the purpose really is just to encourage you to try a variety of things in your own conference work. Okay, so I'm going to hand off to Josh to talk about the first leg of our stool.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, so the first leg is choosing the right platform for your conference goals. And we believe that for informal networking events in the virtual space, spatial platforms are ideal. So these are platforms where you can move yourself around. They come in different forms, but they allow people to, join and leave conversations at will. And this is very similar to a real world gathering, a cocktail party, or a conference hallway for that matter. Now, of course, networking can happen in different parts of a conference, like exhibit halls, poster sessions, roundtable discussions. Many of these spatial platforms have spatial representations of these different rooms that allow attendees choice and agency for who they are going to talk to. And that's kind of the main point. So these are available now, and they're a great resource for informal networking. Another set of features that we're exploring have to do with social network analysis, an approach taken at in-person conferences by folks like Florian Windhager and Julia Eberly, if you're familiar with their work. But in a social network analysis, basically people at the conference are represented as nodes in the network, and their relationships are links. So links could represent different kinds of relationships, like people who know one another, people who've co-authored papers together, people who cite other people's papers. Or it could even be the links could even be an aggregate of relations. And this is an extension of the profile idea that some platforms already have. And it actually speaks to what Andy Burnett was talking about in the plenary earlier today. He was talking about those maps, but it's a similar kind of a notion of helping people find the right person to talk to. So here the system could do all kinds of things. A platform that has a social network analysis embedded in it, it could suggest sessions that you might want to attend based on the sessions that the people that are attending. The analysis would also allow the platform to show you degrees of separation between attendees. So for example, it could help people find friends of friends, or people who are 2 degrees of separation away from each other. Like in this case, connecting the person shown in blue with the person shown in brown. So here's just a mock-up of what this could look like. This doesn't exist yet, as far as we know. But if you were in a spatial platform and let's say at a coffee break, the system could show you with like colored rings around individuals, people who are different degrees of separation away from you. So if you hovered over a person, it would show you who the person is, but it would also show you people in common, and also interests that you might have in common. So, and then you could hover over the next person to see who you might want to talk with. And what's cool about this is it would be an instant conversation starter, because you could immediately talk about the people that you have in common or the interests you have in common. So anyway, those are some examples of existing and near future platform features for improving informal networking. And that's the first leg of our stool. And now back over to you, Sue, to talk about the next leg of our stool.
Thank you. And so I'm going to talk about activities. Josh just talked about how platforms can improve virtual conferencing, but just as important is the kind of activity that you do on those platforms. And that's the second leg. We've been thinking of these mostly in terms of a continuum of structure, from unstructured to pretty structured. And so here are some examples of that. On the unstructured end, this is the kind of thing that Josh was talking about before, things like a coffee break, and thinking about ways that people can be helped to mingle in an open space like that. An example of a semi-structured activity would be something like this. So this is a place where, again, in a spatial avatar-based platform, where a facilitator can ask people to situate themselves, just drag their little icons around along a scale of some kind as a way to get them to talk about something that's related to their work, perhaps, but still general enough to feel inclusive. So here's an example where you could ask people what kinds of boundaries they like to keep between their professional and personal lives, something everyone could talk about. And then when they move, then you can get some conversation going, either people talking to their neighbors or by sharing with the whole group. Also, here's another example that is a bit more on the structured side. So we're calling this the after mingle. And it's really just the equivalent of what people do at an in-person conference at the end of a session, where often people will sort of gather in small groups and talk about its relevance to them. And those can be just some of the most stimulating and collaborative conversations. They're very rich often. So this, in the virtual space, you can do the same thing on any kind of platform. It can be spatial, or it could be more traditional like Zoom, using breakouts, so that everyone has a chance to share their thoughts. That's why a small group is really valuable for this kind of activity. And it can be opt-in or opt-out. We've done it both ways, as long as it's a choice, so that people really want to be there and have something to say to each other. And we've also been thinking about how it could scale at large conferences, where most breakouts don't have a speaker or even a facilitator in their room with them. So how can you help people to engage with the content and each other if you don't have a human facilitator? And of course, it can be just open discussion, but we've also found that it's helpful to offer a few prompts based on the content of the talk or the session that everyone just heard. And you can ask presenters to write those provocative questions ahead of time. Or one thing we've been playing with is asking AI to read the abstracts of the session that was just presented and come up with a set of great questions that the group can then draw from. We've actually been impressed by the quality of those questions, and we used them to good effect in a recent conference. Okay, so that was some examples of activities. Now I'm going to pass it back to Josh for social norms.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've heard a lot at this conference about how the attendance at interactive events in virtual conferences tends to drop off, that people tend to like the presentational and they don't like the networking. And we think that people are uncomfortable networking in the virtual space. And we believe that that's in part because we don't really have good shared norms yet for how to interact. An example of a shared norm would be, that we've all learned to mute and unmute ourselves when we're in a big Zoom call. When we want to speak, you unmute, and otherwise you're muted. So our main suggestion here, and the thing that we're really trying out and working on, is having event leaders introduce specific social norms for particular activities. So for instance, it's hard to know how to join a group when you're in an unstructured, informal networking event like a coffee break. And here an event leader could introduce a social norm at the start. So they could say something like, well, if you see someone hovering just outside your group, say hello and invite them in to join you. We could also introduce social norms for breakout rooms. I mean, I don't know how it is for you folks, but I've often found myself in a breakout room and there's like an awkward silence. And then someone says, wait, what are we supposed to do again? And this kind of thing can really be helped by explicitly stating norms and instructions. Like, when you get in the breakout room, choose a facilitator. We're not going to be reporting back whatever it is you say in the breakout room, and so on. But more importantly, giving people a link to a file that has those norms for reference while they're in the breakout room, so that once they get there, they know what they're doing. Another possible approach to this would be to use AI to partially facilitate a conversation. So if the AI hears a lull in the conversation, it could jump in with a prompt. Or maybe even have an AI fully facilitate by introducing the breakout session, asking people to introduce themselves, giving people a topic, and so on. So we feel that it's really important to think about social norms in a wide range of situations where attendees are unfortunately often left to fend for themselves. We think that we need social norms for using the platform, and I gave the example of muting and unmuting, for interacting with other people, and we talked a little bit about joining conversations, norms for that, and then for spontaneous facilitation, and we talked a little bit about AI and other approaches for facilitation. So that's the social norm leg, and back to you, Sue, to wrap it all up.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so just to recap, if your goal is to improve virtual networking, we think it's important to select the right platform for your needs, to create activities with different degrees of structure depending on your goals, and to develop and introduce social norms for a variety of virtual contexts. And then just last thing I wanted to just say was, of course, we've presented these as separate legs, but truly they're all connected because these areas of design are overlapping and interconnected. So we want to think about them in a more coherent way as we design for ongoing improvements. So that's the end. And we would just say, please do contact us via email or our website, cleanconferencing.org, if you'd like to talk with us more and share ideas, because we are all in this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for those great talks. So I'm going to go ahead and first see if there are any clarifying questions that anybody has for the current speakers. And I can tell pretty much by the timestamp which ones came in. Let's see. So there is a question in here saying, thinking about the social network analysis, do you think this is a benefit of online events? In-person events can be much more challenging to know how you're connected to individuals.
Yes, what we've been working on at the Clean Conferencing Institute is what are the kinds of features, platform features, activities, and social norms that would make virtual events even better than in-person events. And one of the things that we've really been focusing on, I was so excited to hear Andy Burnett talk about this morning or earlier, is finding your people, right? Who are the right people that you want to talk with at this conference? And that's where we think that social network analysis, particularly at a virtual conference, particularly at a large virtual conference, could really help people find the right folks to talk with. And that's where that 2 degrees of separation, or maybe even 3 degrees of separation idea would really come in handy. And yeah, I think it could be, you could probably implement it in an in-person conference. People have created social networks based on who is at a conference, and they've even had folks, wearing their name tag, and it has an RFID tag inside of it. So when you are talking to someone, the system knows that you've interacted with each other. But it seems like it would be much, much easier to do that in a virtual setting.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move to the general discussion. So if all of the speakers could come on, we've got quite a few questions in chat. Some are more specific to specific speakers, and I'll start with those, and then I'll start moving to the broader ones as we go along. But feel free to answer any of these if you have insight as well. So this one goes back to, let's see, make sure I can see all of my questions. Maybe. Hold on one second. Did something funny to me. Okay, so back to Ariane. The question. This one's for you. It said, "Thank you for the presentation. Is your survey or in your survey or in the interviews, did you specifically see any differences in experiences or preferences due to different qualification phases?"
Yes, so thank you for that question. And I think it's really important to also look at these differences between career positions, right? And in the survey, I distinguished between professors and then the scientific staff. And actually, if you remember the graph where I showed on the effectiveness of virtual conferences, there was one difference. So the perceived effectiveness of gaining inspiration for their own research. So the early career scientists or the scientific staff actually perceived this as more effective than the professors who perceived it as less effective. And also, I had another question in the survey, which I didn't show today, but I asked about their general opinion on virtual conferences, and their professor perceived virtual conferences the least positive. And of course, this could also be something that has to do with age, so biological age. I didn't look into that, but that would certainly also be interesting. And also the perceived lack of feedback or social signals was perceived more challenging by the professors than the scientific staff. But this was a very slight difference. And I mean, not now related to my surveys, but the overall discussion on the topic, and also what I know from other studies and other people who do research on this. I think what's always mentioned is that especially the networking part seems to be, or is perceived to be, more important for the early career scientists. But it's also interesting that often these comments come from actually the seniors. So yeah, I think this is also where more research needs to be done, and we should look into like how do also is this just a perception that like exists generally, or is it also how early careers really feel? I think you're still muted.
Thank you. That little mute button got me this time. What I was asking is with this, were the professors that was there a relationship between how many or the quality and quantity of virtual platforms or presentation conferences that the professors have attended? Did that affect whether they liked or disliked or changed their opinion? Sometimes I wonder if some people maybe attended one or two conferences and said, this is horrible, and this quit attending, and then all are horrible, versus some that have persevered through technological challenges.
Mm-hmm. So that is a good observation, and in this series I didn't specifically look at that, but also from other research that I've done, and also I think it was also mentioned in my interviews, like the experience or the previous experience is certainly a factor that plays a big role. And this has also to do with what our last presenters showed, like with the social norms, right? So actually, in the interviews, I was told by virtual conference organizers who did or organized the virtual conference several times that every time it actually gets easier because people who participated or attended the first time, they are aware of these like very, very small social norms, right? As Josh said, for example, unmuting or muting, or like, oh, okay, there is actually another Slack platform that exists, and we need to structure it according to topics so that everybody can follow. And in the first year, this organizer told me it was only the organizers who were like nudging the attendees to behave according to the virtual norms. And then in the second year, it was also the other attendees who remembered from the first year, okay, this is how we do it, or this is how we should behave. And I think also in like the traditional in-person conferences, it's what we do, right? Like a lot of the younger ones or the early career scientists or even the bachelor master students, when they attend their first conference, it's usually like an advice of the seniors. Yeah, attend your first conference, come and have a look how everything works, like get familiar with the setting. How does a conference really work? So why should it be different in virtual conferences? It's exactly the same. We need to attend and observe what are the norms, what are the rules, the spoken, unspoken ones, and then we need to get used to it over time.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Can I jump, Dana, can I jump in there?
Oh, absolutely.
I just want to know, do we want to have more of a panel conversation, or do you want to go through questions? Because I would love to just say something quickly about what Ariane just said.
No, go ahead and add. I think where there's opportunities to add, go ahead, and then I'll move to the next question once you wrap up, or if anybody else has.
Yeah, Ariane, I was just wondering what you think about. You were just talking about people. Why should it be different in the virtual space? Like, why don't we have the same expectations of showing up and looking and watching and kind of observing the way you would in a real conference? And I think that's such a great point. And I'm wondering what you think about what Sue and I were presenting on around making social norms explicit. So having event organizers or leaders at the event actually say, for this activity, we're going to behave with each other this way, or, it's okay if you want to keep mingling to talk to somebody for a few minutes and then let them know that you want to keep moving on, or something like that. Like, what do you think about being more articulating those norms and being more explicit?
Yes, I think that's really the point, that we need to make it more explicit and mention it, especially the first times. And then maybe if we would mention it like in let's say a regular online seminar every week, then people might be bored if it's always the same people. But especially in like the first times, or if we have new people showing up, then we should make it more explicit and mention it, and also mention it a few times until we see, okay, people are doing it automatically. Yes, and I think that's also what came out of my interviews or my research, that like usually in the virtual format there's more structure needed, and structure in the sense of like planning things, but then also giving instructions, and not just for like the norms, also like, as you did today, right? When you start the session, okay, this is what's going to happen, this is the amount of time we have, this is how everything works, also like how the tools work, for example, if not everybody's familiar, how much time is scheduled for what. So yeah, everything needs to be made a little bit more, or it needs to be more structured and communicated more formally.
Can I just chime in there too? A quick comment
Great.
of just. Oh,
Absolutely.
I think. Thanks. I think we have a slight time lag. Just thinking too about, Josh and I've been reading The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, and finding it such a helpful contributor to our thinking, because it really focuses on this idea of hosting, and the importance of having somebody take the role of a sort of social glue in a group that doesn't know each other. And so that's something I feel like we don't think about very much at conferences. There's sort of these standardized roles, but what about if we had norms that were more about, when I show up in a breakout room and there's no facilitator, my norm, so for example, some of my colleagues will say, I've done this so many times, my norm is that I first wait and see if anyone else is going to step in and take a facilitation role. And then if nobody does, I will be the person that does it because I've done it enough to feel comfortable. So I think there's something there too around what are our expectations around discomfort, that quiet time that Josh was talking about, where you aren't sure if you're, who's speaking or what you're supposed to do. I think if we were all a little bit more trained in hosting norms, if you like, that it might also help things to move along more easily.
If I can jump in here as well. I think that's really interesting. And I think there's sort of 2 points about that. Some of the research that I briefly mentioned at the end, we were recording scientific conversations that were moderated by a facilitator. So we have hundreds of hours of this, both in person and virtual. And although we don't have full findings from this already, I think what it's pointing to us is that different people have different leadership styles, which may be more or less effective, particularly at distributing the conversation equitably. So I think in addition to these norms, we need to provide some kind of guidance and training for the people who choose to be facilitators, but also distributing who takes on those leadership roles, because we know that there are certain people who typically would take on those roles, and that's not necessarily, if it's self-organized, it may not necessarily be equitable. And the other aspect of this, I think, concerning how to enter and leave groups, I don't have the answer to this, but I think it's important to think about cultural relevance of these norms, and working with people from countries outside the US and Europe, for example, when developing these norms. Because I think in person, and this is probably true online as well, people have really different ways of starting conversations, different norms around greetings and exiting conversations. And so I think for everyone to feel comfortable, we need to sort of co-develop a lot of these norms versus necessarily having them just from a US or Europe perspective, particularly if we're trying to use all the benefits of virtual conferencing to expand access across the world.
Thanks. And I know there is a little bit of a lag on my side, so I'm sorry for that. I tried restarting and it's still going, or still laggy, but hopefully you guys can suffer with me. So there is a question for you, Dr. Jadela. about, does the comparison of in-person and online assume that there are the same number of participants at both events? And do you think that the reduction in networking can be outweighed by the increase in global reach of conferences?
So I think there's a couple points here. Some research that we didn't present, we were looking at American Physical Society conferences in the US, which are much larger scale, about 10,000 participants per conference. What we were seeing is that there is an increase overall in participation. There also has been some research showing that virtual conferences are more diverse in terms of their participation, particularly in terms of global reach. But I think the question about, do you think the reduction in networking can be outweighed in terms of what? I think what our research was showing is that for relatively equivalent conferences in terms of participation and size and goals, even with attempts to use virtual tools like GatherTown and fostering these informal interactions, at least those tools were not sufficient compared to in-person conferences for generating networking. And I think this kind of goes to my broader view of virtual and in-person conferences, is that there are trade-offs when selecting these conferences, and that both formats can learn from one another. So one of the benefits of the virtual conferences may be that we have more diverse, not just participation, but also we have some evidence showing that groups may be more diverse at our forms. So combating homophily effects, for example, by having people form teams through groups that are assigned, versus in an in-person conference, a lot of those informal interactions might create teams that are more homophilous. So I think that there's sort of trade-offs when deciding whether to do virtual or in-person or perhaps hybrid, and that ultimately the goal should be to actually have in-person conferences learn from some of the beneficial aspects of virtual and vice versa, try to bring in some of the things that we're losing in a virtual context from the in-person side.
Thank you. I have one quick
jump in on there, Dana?
Can I ask one quick clarifying question, which ties into this and was one of the other questions? It was asking about online conferences, and a lot of it has been reported back as networking opportunities that are reduced in that platform. But would you say that the research actually shows that that's the case? And I think that ties into a lot of what's going on here. I mean, is this truly the case?
So I think there's sort of two factors, and our research is only analyzing a set of conferences, so other conferences are different. But the main conferences we analyze, these SILOG conferences, are, at least during COVID, they were sort of the best possible case scenario, where the structure of the conference was held almost exactly the same between in-person and virtual, including the amount of time allocated for informal interaction through these networking opportunities. So I think there are two aspects. One, networking opportunities are often reduced in terms of time, and that may be additional time constraints that people have by having virtual conference with time zones, for example, or things at home that people need to take care of. So there's the time component. And then the other component is the actual effectiveness of that interaction. And in what we were studying, where there was a pretty similar format between both, the networking effectiveness was reduced at virtual conferences, which is why I think we need new tools, like was being described, to actually have better opportunities for networking. But I think based on our research, and particularly things like spatial interaction and GatherTown are not sufficient or not comparable.
And Josh, go ahead and
Yeah, thanks, Dana. Yeah, for everyone here, I would love for us to just talk a little bit about hybrid conferencing for a second, because we've mentioned it a few times, and I'm especially curious about Emma and Ariane's your different research, and what it might tell us about hybrid. At the Clean Conferencing Institute, we're happy to help anyone with a hybrid conference if they want to do that. But we don't really encourage hybrid. We've tried it at a very small number of conferences. It's very challenging. It takes a lot of effort and cost to do well. especially if you're trying to bring the virtual attendees into contact with the in-person attendees in any way. But more importantly, as I think Ariane mentioned, it sort of creates, second-class citizens. Like the first-class citizens get to have the food and go to the fun events, and they're in person and they have a great time. And then the virtual folks, they get to watch some talks, and maybe they get to do some networking. And I'm wondering what your research says about hybrid and whether you would recommend it, or whether you would recommend doing something like alternating between virtual and in-person more, or some other approach.
Well, I think one of the things that Ariane pointed out is that there are a multitude of hybrid formats. Some are, like you're saying, might be more conducive to this sort of second-class citizen type of experience. I was recently involved in a hybrid conference that had one of these that had two on-site locations, and then the participants were virtually connected from each of the locations through an online platform. That had some success, but I kind of agree with you that I feel like more anecdotally, hybrid conferences tend, instead of having the best of both worlds, sometimes seem to have the worst of both worlds. Where even for in-person conference attendees, it can be frustrating, where people travel, spend a lot of money and carbon emissions to come to a site, and then half of the people are virtually and only presenting for their talk, for example. But I, at least from my research, I don't have any conclusive evidence yet of how to go with that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Emma. I also see or hear about both sides, but I think we should also always think about, like, what do we compare it to? Like, being for somebody who has the option of like not attending at all, or attending a hybrid conference virtually and maybe having a worse experience in terms of social interactions, networking, private discussions, exchanges, that might still be better than not being able to join at all or getting access to the content, right? And that's also what some of my research shows, like from people with these backgrounds or really these disadvantages, like raising their voices and like saying, oh, this is fantastic that you are thinking about us too, that we are finally also able to join. And I mean, this can be different reasons. We heard about all of these reasons. Visa restrictions, children, low funding, physical and mental health issues, everything, right? And for them, some of them are saying, this is fantastic because it's my only chance I have. But of course, others, and usually it's also the ones who are quite privileged, who are used to just attend and go there in person, they can then also have these more negative thoughts or these feelings of, oh, now I spent a lot of money on traveling and paying for a hotel, and now I don't even get to interact with people from far away. And yes, I recently had the chance or the opportunity to analyze a multi-hub conference. They had, I think, 5 or 6 hubs, mostly in the North US and Europe, and one in Mexico as well. And actually the feedback from attendees, so we did a pre and post conference survey, was overall very positive. Of course, there were several things mentioned as challenging, as you said, the interaction between the hubs or the like virtual and in-person. But the overall feedback was very positive, and also we asked about future preference, and the future preference was clearly hybrid hub format. So I think many challenges remain, and in some cases it might be better to just have it alternating, but in other cases it also can be a good choice, and yeah, we also have to think, what do we compare it to, right? And another interesting anecdote from actually the research of my colleagues, where she also surveyed conference attendees, and she asked about the future preference of the conference format. The most preferred option was the hybrid format. She didn't distinguish between hybrid formats. But then when she asked participants, okay, and in which way would you attend? Most of them said, oh yeah, I would go there in person. And most of them were like more the privileged researchers from Europe, where they also thought, okay, well, I have fast train connections. Of course, I will go there. I have the money and I have the time.
I just wanted to give an interesting anecdotal piece as well. So in January, I was an observer with Princeton University at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And this is a little bit different than a scientific conference, although it does involve scientists. But I thought it was interesting because there was a big push, particularly from Western countries, to move the IPCC virtual as it had been during the pandemic. And in that case, most of the developing countries were actively against moving the conference virtual, although it is the IPCC dealing with climate change, so there are obvious benefits to moving this online. But the people from developing countries felt like, for a multitude of reasons, moving the conference virtually would really harm them. So in particular, as I mentioned earlier, the internet connectivity issues, also time zone issues, the fact that in many developing countries, people, if they're working, they won't get time off for attending a virtual conference the same way that they would for an in-person conference. So they're expected to actually have their typical workload on top of a virtual conference. And then finally, in the case of the IPCC, where there's some sort of science diplomacy negotiations going on, people really felt like the in-person component was really key to finding consensus on challenging scientific topics. So I thought that was just an interesting example of sort of the opposite that we often hear, where the scientists from developed countries wanted to move things online, and vice versa, those from developing really wanted to meet in person.
Great. Thank you so much for those anecdotes. The another question that pivots just slightly is one that asks, what works for engaging audiences in virtual meetings? So, when so many people are easily distracted or multitasking, because obviously if they're not engaged, they're not going to be networking either. So any of you?
Well, I could say something. One of the experiences we've had now multiple times is when we survey people about a virtual conference, they'll say, we particularly focus on the virtual networking, the informal networking, and they'll say, yes, I went to some sessions, but I wish they had been longer. And then they say, well, and actually I had to leave because I had, some other responsibility that I had to do. And so I ended up coming to the sessions. And so I think there's this funny sort of dilemma thing that might go on sometimes where people feel sort of drawn to sessions because that's the legitimate or historical or credible thing that you go, is to do this sort of formalized learning. But when you talk to them afterwards, they really regret not having spent more time in the informal parts. And so that's yet again where I feel like it's this whole field that we're trying to move forward on at once, to try to find this combination of platforms, tools, norms, activities, things where we can just gradually learn to make these spaces more welcoming. We know, for example, that when people come to an online, they spawn in a spatial chat, for instance, which is a platform we've been using quite a lot. If there isn't somebody there right away to say, hi, welcome, do you know how to navigate? Do you know how to get around? Would you like me to, help you with anything? Then suddenly there's so much pressure on them to to have to figure things out, and it's all happening just right away. So this kind of just-in-time need for quite a lot of tech support, particularly at those moments where you're feeling vulnerable. You've just appeared in an informal networking space. You don't know anyone. You don't know who to talk to. You don't even know how to move around. So I think there's just a whole lot of work that our field could still be doing to make those transitions more effective and more supported.
And
that makes a lot of sense, especially. Sure, especially if you think about science of behavior change, how hard it is to get people to change behavior. So I can certainly see that, Sue. Yes, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I see a real connection between this question about, I'm distracted at home, maybe I have kids at home or something, and actually some of the things Emma was just saying about people from developing countries at the IPCC saying, if I go to a virtual conference, I'm not going to get time off. I'm not, I won't be sort of allowed to really focus on the conference. And, at the Clean Conferencing Institute, we've been talking a lot and thinking a lot about change at the systemic level. And this, so, to make this change towards more virtual, it's not just about the attendees and it's not just about the organizers. It's about other folks like funders and employers and people who are sending people, paying for people to go to conferences. It's interesting to me that a person in a developing country, or I'm making this up, but maybe the global south, is unable to get time off to go to a virtual conference, but they would be paid to travel perhaps a long distance to go to an in-person conference. Like, that's a policy decision that needs to be shifted. And similarly, employers could, instead of paying for your airfare and your hotel and your food when you go to a conference, employers or funders, if you're going on a grant, could pay for childcare. So that even though you're home, you have childcare taking care of your small children while you're attending. Or maybe it pays for you to go to a co-working space where you can go, in your town, you can go to one of those co-work office spaces and have some quiet and some isolation. So I think there needs to be solutions beyond even like the kinds of things we've been talking about and, the three-legged stool we have. That's just for how do you make the informal, the nuts and bolts better. There's systemic issues that we need to tackle, and we're trying to have those conversations with funders and employers.
If I may add a point or 2 points. So one thing that came up in my interviews as well was that actually participants said that they would like to have platforms or softwares that allowed them to also see where the others attendees go, because at in-person conferences often it is also the case that you like you engage in a chat with someone, and then you ask them, oh, okay, which session are you attending next? And then you kind of tag along because you're still in a conversation, or it might be your colleague or your supervisor, your friend. And in a virtual conference, often you don't see where are the others going, like which is like the sessions where everybody's going, and maybe you're afraid, okay, am I now the only one if I click on this button? And this is really like a huge difference to like the in-person setting where you can see, okay, and you can have a peek in the room, okay, not so many people here, I might not feel comfortable, or too many people, I might not get to say anything, I go to the next one. So that is certainly something that can be done to like show where the other attendees go. And the other thing is also to adapt, to like think about conference, and especially this like traditional conference structure or format that I showed on my first slide, and to think how can we do differently. And I think things that were mentioned to me were also like to spread out conferences over a longer time period, or do it more regularly. So this might then go in the direction of what we would not maybe call a conference, but like seminars or virtual weekly, monthly meetings. And then people usually have more time to schedule these into their busy schedules, right? Than an entire 4 to 6 hours of a virtual conference.
And I'm just going to jump in here too and riff on that, Ariane, for a minute, especially the earlier parts you were talking about of knowing who else is going to a session. Or for us, we've been thinking about breakouts in particular. Sometimes there's either in Zoom or in platforms that have like roundtable representations where people will sort of gather at a particular roundtable. And often that's the place where you can't see who the other attendees are. And it's so key because when you move into that small group discussion, you know you're going to be talking with people. And it's so helpful if you can do a quick scan of who is at this table or this breakout room and who is at the next table or breakout room. So from that side too, of someone looking for a place to settle in a small group setting, it's a place where the tools tend to not be effective in that way. And just a quick call out actually to Chatty, which is the platform that LabRoots uses. They do actually have a roundtable system they're coming out with, which allows you to see who else is sitting at the table before you decide, you know, without having to embarrass yourself by sitting and leaving. You can just see whether it's something that you want to join or not.
Josh, I think you wanted to add something. Oh, nope, you said Sue just hit it. Okay. I have a, go ahead, Emma, if you want to add something.
Just a brief follow-up on that about the breakout sessions. I think they're really key, and what our research was showing for formal interaction was that small groups of 3 to 4 people were 10 times more effective for generating collaborations. And although we call that formal interaction because people were assigned to groups, in some sense it is still informal because the participants themselves decide what they want to talk about for the 30 to 45 minutes. So something I've been working on with some other colleagues and has been implemented at the SciLog is developing algorithms for assigning people to groups based on different criteria. So I think that something that could be useful is based on whatever criteria, having diverse groups, having people meet who haven't previously met, diverse in terms of discipline or geographic background, whatever criteria you have. Sometimes pre-assigning people to these groups of 3 to 4 might be really effective way for generating collaborations and discussion.
Great, thank you. I know we only have a couple of minutes left or so. I did see another question in the chat, and it is specifically to Joshua and Sue, but I think most of you, all of you could chime in as well. But it says, it seems that effective virtual network tools require a lot of pre and post-conference work/analysis and information willingly shared by attendees. Do you agree? And what practical challenges do you see?
Sue, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, so I think that's an excellent point. And one of the huge issues that we haven't really talked about is the privacy issue, because, increasingly we live in a world where information is being collected in so many fronts and put together in so many ways. I was reading about a Hippocratic oath for data science, which talks about never collecting data just to collect data for data's sake, and really being aware of the historical context of oppression that's been happening around data for so many years. So I think we're very interested in looking at current privacy policies, and one, at least I think the low bar for that is making sure that people are not surprised by when they suddenly see their own data being used in ways they hadn't anticipated. But I think it's a very important area for us, especially now.
And I just want to jump in and say although it seems like it could be a lot of work, like maybe you're imagining for the social network analysis that you would survey people in advance of the conference, there are methods for doing that much more easily, like scraping Google Scholar to see who has co-authored papers with each other, who references other people in their journal articles. So there are ways to do it that are lower work, keeping, of course, in mind what Sue was talking about around privacy and making sure people know that, you're going to be looking at their Google Scholar listings and things like that.
Thank you all, and thank you for such a great and engaging session. I give my virtual hand applause to this whole session of speakers. This has been terrific. So again, thanks to all the speakers for an excellent panel session and discussion, and thank you to everyone in the audience for submitting very engaging and interesting questions and for participating in this conversation. This concludes our panel session on forging social connections, formal and informal networking at scientific conferences. The next set of concurrent sessions will be at 3 p.m. EDT. In this track, the next session will focus on catalysts of innovation, exploring the impact of scientific convenings on knowledge sharing and idea diffusion. In the track on balancing participant needs and technology for engaging conferences and meetings. And the next session will focus on virtual frontiers, transforming conference experiences with immersive technologies. To join the sessions of your choice, navigate to the auditorium and select the track that you would like to attend. And thank you again for joining, and this concludes this session. Thank you all.